Hello, my name is Preston Vaudry, and today I'm going to be talking about gaming, the pastime and conflict of future generations. So, today we're going to talk a little bit about a brief history of gaming, talk a little bit about where gaming as a pastime came from, and then we're going to define what gaming is, and we're going to show its growth over time to see where we are now. And that's going to be our second learning objective. We're going to talk about recent gaming stats, and we're going to talk about how it can be a potential career field with where it's heading, right? We're going to talk about Gen Y, millennials, and Gen Z, and how they've all adjusted the traditional pastime of gaming to be something completely different from what it was 5,000 years ago, right? So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's start with a brief history of gaming as a pastime. The first game that we know that humans were interacting with goes back to 14th century England called Hazard. Hazard was a game that had a lot of very complex rule sets and was very similar to a lot of dice games we have today. However, a lot of those traditional dice aspects have been removed. In Hazard, there were a lot of moving parts. Characters relied on each other's dice rolls in order to determine their own dice rolls, and there were a lot of these very complex nuances between the way that users would interact with each other's dices and then manage each other in their play structure and their play style. This is a good time for us to define what gaming is. I'm going to define gaming as something that we use as entertainment value that is exclusively based off of how we interact with one another and exclusively based on how we influence the game per play, right? So this is the first traditional game that we know of because it's the first game where we know that users had this interaction with one another where what I do determines what happens during your turn, and then what you do determines what happens to me, right? It's this interactive, interpersonal experience that we have with one another that determines the output of the game, right? It's not something that's passive like a movie or a picture where we experience it purely by seeing, watching, hearing, whatever, right? We have an active role in that entertainment value. So, this isn't actually the first game that we know that existed. It's just the first one that we have knowledge of users interacting with, and we know that they played it. We hypothesize that some of the first games go back to ancient Egypt. The only problem is we don't know for sure whether or not these games were being played by the users or how that game was played. It's possible that it was more of a passive experience, right? And over time, a lot of these gaming experiences changed and shifted and molded so that the user had more to do with the experience, and it wasn't just this set of rules that we were strategizing against, right? The first games were probably something along the lines of chess or checkers, but we just don't know for sure what the rule set was. Over time, the first card game goes back to 6th and 9th century in China, right? And in China, they introduced the first set of weighted practiced on card games. So if I have a king, it can trump a queen. If you have a queen, it can trump a three, right? It's this weighted experience where we're weighing each other's cards against the other, right? And so this enables a lot more of a strategic-based initiative over time where users can create strategies over how to minimize and maximize their hand at a given point to help beat their competition, right? Over time, games have shifted, added more rule sets, and the traditional card or board-based game started to shift right around industrial times when people had more stability in their life to be able to put more financing into a gaming system, and people had more free time to really expand on what the idea of a game was. So this is when we start to see the first introduction of table-based games. And these are more than just one-on-one gameplay or multiple people sitting around a board strategizing around a rule set. But now it's more interactive, where we introduce these instruments of play, where it's not just your hand on a table piece, but it's also a pool cue. It's also a ping pong paddle, right? We introduce these rule sets that allow for that gameplay to expand over time. And then we start to see video games be made. The first game isn't actually 1970s Pong, as a lot of people think of. It was actually a physicist named William Higginbotham that created something very, very similar to what we know as the first table tennis game called Pong in a video sphere, right? This was, as far as I can tell, there's not a ton of information on it. It was a single player based game where the user was playing Pong against themselves back and forth across a digital grid that we can see here, right? Naturally, gaming shifts over time a bunch, and that digital realm allows everything to expand substantially over time. And we start to see these console computer-based video systems that allow for users to really, really dive into what it means to play a game, right? This entire world and universe expands out of, the single digital Pong experience, right? So one of the things that's very, very interesting about gaming is that there isn't necessarily one segmented part of the population that does it. Everything from card games and board games all the way up to complete simulated VR experiences kind of varies across the entire market. We can see in some of the statistics on this graph here that according to a 2017 survey of users, there isn't necessarily one group of users that doesn't spend any money on games. There is about 1% of users who don't know how much that they spend, but this could be either they don't know how much they spend because they spend a lot, or they don't spend very much, right? You will see that there is a subset of the population, about 40%, that is spending between $600 and over $1,000 on games, right? And that's a significant portion. Even if we reduce the cut to, $400 to over $1,000, we're still seeing quite a significant amount of people are more and more often spending money on a game experience, which is really, really interesting, because now we're starting to see in the industry some cognitive behavioral changes, right? And there's a little bit of debate between whether video gaming specifically can be perceived as a pro or a con. There's something that's called internet gaming disorder that we're starting to see more often in teenagers who aren't able to express themselves, whether emotionally or through words, through whatever reason. They struggle to connect themselves to external problems and internalize their own frustrations into what we manifest as internet gaming disorder. This shows as antisocial behavior, anger control problems, and hyperactivity. This is important to note that if somebody did have a parent with mental health problems, they're more likely to represent internet gaming or to manifest internet gaming disorder. One thing that we do know is that moderate gameplay has been found to contribute to emotional stability and reduced emotional disturbances in children. What we define as moderate gameplay, though, does have a little bit of nuance, right? What's moderate to one person might be excessive to another. And so there's still a lot of data being sifted through about whether the video game industry is overall net beneficial to its users. And so over time, we're going to start to see some of this data come in, and it'll have a lot of information for us to know. So far, most journals, the latest publications come from 2017, so the data is still kind of unknown. So gaming is still radically changing over time. A lot of cultural shifts are happening, where the 2017 Super Bowl viewership had more viewers, or had less viewers than the League of Legends World Tournament, right? And we're starting to see more individuals with the ability to make a career out of it. Granted, there's still a little bit of 1%ers making more than the 90% of gaming users, where like you can see the top 5 players here are making between 5 and 7 million, but the average video game professional is going to make less than $5,000 a month, which is around $60,000 a year. And on the low end of that side, people are going to be making almost close to the poverty line in the gaming sphere. So there's still a long way for gaming to go as a professional career and as an option for people to think of. But we're definitely going to see a lot of really, really cool changes over time when it comes to the way that gaming works for our society. These are some of the sources that I used for today's presentation, and thank you so much for watching.